You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. Alex Lewin, he's the head of Real Food Fermentation. Alex, thank you for coming. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks, Rich. How are you?
Good. Yeah, I see that you authored a book, Real Food Fermentation, and then another one, Kombucha, Kefir, and Beyond, with a co-author, and it's great. So how did you get into fermented foods and this whole area of culture, essentially?
It started, I'm telling this story with perfect hindsight because I didn't know that this was why it happened the way it did. And it's still just sort of putting the pieces together. So many times we get somewhere in our life and we're not sure exactly how we got there. But my dad had heart disease and he wasn't healthy for a lot of his life. And I hit a certain age and I got interested in health. And I can say now, I think that's because I was terrified of not being healthy. It's obvious now, but I don't think I quite understood it then. So I started reading books about health and nutrition, and it was confusing to me because I had a math and science and physics background, I guess, and I was used to having clear explanations for things. And I started reading about health and nutrition, and one book would say, you have to eat carbohydrates and fats and proteins in a certain ratio. I said, oh, that makes sense. And then another book said, you mustn't ever eat, proteins and carbohydrates together because it's the worst thing you can do because you can't digest them together. I'm like, And I'm trying to fit all these pieces together. There are all these books that make very convincing arguments for certain things that are partially contradicted by the other books that make very good arguments. So I started turning the puzzle pieces over in my head, and to make a long story a little shorter, I stumbled upon fermentation, and it occupied this perfect intersection of health, sustainability, sort of food and culinary world, sort of world of anthropology and human history and prehistory, and it just struck a chord for me. And it also was a way to empower people to do something, even when the world felt like everything was out of their control. They could take a cabbage and they could make sauerkraut and they could eat it. And that would be reclaiming part of the world and breaking free of the industrial food machine and all that. So that's the short version. And I obviously will talk at great length about whichever part of it seems interesting to you or whatever else you want to ask me.
Yeah, as a quick list, what are some fermented foods that people may just maybe even be marginally aware are fermented or not aware at all?
I mean, most of the good things that people eat are fermented. Pickles are maybe one of the first things people think of on one side, and then beer on the other side. But anything with yeast in it is fermented. We'll take a step back and say, what is fermented? Fermented means, in a food context, it's food that's been acted on by microbes. Microbes are bacteria, yeast, and mold. And so anything that's been acted on by yeast is fermented. So like not only beer, but wine, bread, that covers a lot. And then anything acted on by bacteria, so anything sour, pretty much. So, many kinds of pickles, yogurt, any kind of sour dairy product, most cheeses. And then there are things like olives and chocolate and coffee and a lot of things that people don't think of as being fermented, but that rely on microbes for some part of the process of their creation. And then there are the mold ferments, like, dried sausage that has this sort of white stuff on the outside. It's mold. And then some cheese is moldy. And a lot of the Asian ferments, like soy sauce and miso and tempeh, are all driven by mold ferments, or at least started by them.
It's weird if you think about it, is everything we eat, our gut bacteria help digest. So literally everything we eat, even if it's not fermented, it goes through at least a partial fermentation phase to be consumable. And then, when you think about fermented food, it's like an extension of your natural body anyway. It's just a partial digestion or alteration before it even gets to your mouth. But literally everything we eat has to be fermented somewhat.
I mean, that's totally it. And one of the advantages of eating food that's started its fermentation outside of your body is you get sort of a head start on digesting it, which means you can digest it maybe more completely. Maybe there's some toxic compounds in it that get neutralized somewhat by the pre-digestion. Maybe the nutrients in it become more bioavailable within your body. So that's one part of it, is increasing the digestibility and bioavailability of nutrients. Another part is supplementing the microbes that live in your body, mostly bacteria that live in your gut that help you digest foods once they're in your gut. And, there are numbers that appear now and then about like what percentage of the cells within the confines of your body are actually human cells. And I've heard different numbers, but it seems pretty certain that most of the cells inside of the confines of your body are not human cells. Like most of them are bacteria. And so we are not really, I've thought about using the first person plural and just referring to myself with a royal we, and I can justify that by, doing just a count of the cells in my body. The other interesting factoid is, 90-something% of the unique genetic material within your body is not human genetic material. It's microbes of some sort. So, it's interesting. Without the microbes, we'd be lost.
No, it's true. It's true. So, I know my reaction historically, and a lot of people's reaction is, that's dirty, or that's quote unquote clean, or that's sanitary, or, there's bacteria on this, get rid of them. What I found really interesting when I started learning a little bit about ferments is that, you're deliberately introducing bacteria, and the bacteria that get introduced, they set up the environment to be hospitable to them, which crowds out what we call bad bacteria, like in a kombucha or sauerkraut or whatever it is. And it's funny, we do the same thing in our stomach. The bacteria that live there, our stomach produces a lot of acid, and that keeps a lot of the bad guys out. So we're like a living kombucha ourselves in a way,
Yeah, totally. And I look at it in military terms, although I'm a pretty serious pacifist, and I'm very sad about a lot of human history, but we form alliances with certain groups of microbes that can help defend us against certain other ones, because there are certain microbes, like the ones that make sauerkraut, for instance, that are very helpful to us. And there are other ones, like the ones that create toxic compounds like botulism, that are very dangerous to us. And so we create an environment where the quote unquote friendly microbes can multiply so that they'll just crowd out the scary ones. So fermentation is strategic alliance with certain microbes. And another popular means of preserving is canning. And canning is very different, because when you're canning, you create a sealed environment, and then you try to kill all of the microbes in there, and you hope that it's sealed well and that you killed all the microbes. And, if you follow the guidelines for canning, there's some pretty well accepted and very conservative, safe guidelines for canning. So if you cook something boiling at sea level for some number of minutes, then you will have killed everything. So canning can be safe too, but the canning is more of a massacre, and fermenting is more of diplomacy, I like to say.
What are the main factors that will allow a ferment to be successful or not? It seems like air or no air. aerobic or anaerobic, pH, maybe temperature. What are the main factors that you see that allow ferments to either work or not?
A lot of it, the ones you mentioned are definitely key. The factors in any kind of microbial food safety are the same. And when you take a food safety class that you have to take if you're managing a restaurant or something like that, there's an acronym, and it's FAT-TOM. So food, acidity, temperature, time, oxygen, and moisture. So each of those things is one of the factors. With fermenting, a lot of times you're with bacterial ferments like sauerkraut and pickles and the sour things, you're really playing with the acidity most of all. If you can get something below a pH of 4.6, so more sour than 4.6 or more sour or more acidic, the pathogenic microbes that can survive are basically none, or they'll be crowded out by the happy microbes. So with bacterial ferments, that's acidity is the main one. With the others, it can be a little more complicated. Certainly, other means of preserving, like when you're canning, you're just killing everything. If you're drying, you rely on just creating an environment where there's no moisture, and if there's no moisture, then pretty much nothing. Very few dangerous things will thrive there. So if you think of like beef jerky or dry sausage or even bread, bread will go a few days, and if it's sourdough bread, it'll go longer because it's more sour and more acidic. So that's sort of, it's not, the parameters aren't any different than any other kind of food safety. It's just the way you create the way you get out of the food danger zone is using the microbes to help you.
I wonder why, an acidic environment, it makes me think that tends to mimic our stomach environment, so that, things that would survive an acidic environment and a ferment would also probably survive our stomach. And our stomach, selects for that using its acid. And maybe that's why acidic things are things that we can, we're able to eat more often than not. And they favor the bacteria that we're able to work with. It's just a thought process.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a lot of that. And, we evolved alongside these bacteria, and they evolved often inside of us. And so it's definitely a case of symbiosis. And so it's not a coincidence, I don't think. I mean, it's hard to say what really happened and when, because it's just a long time ago. But we are creatures that rely on acidity for the safety of our digestive tract, for sure. Yeah.
I don't know if you know this, but the bacteria that are predominant in ferments, are they also predominant in our bodies, or not necessarily?
There's a lot of overlap. It's a little hard because there are some ferments, there are categories of ferments where, like most of the commercial yogurt, you add a specific few bacteria to it and they create the acidity in the yogurt. Or if you take a probiotic pill, there are certain known microbes in the pill. If you make a sauerkraut using whatever microbes show up, there's a slightly broader variety of microbes. But if you make something like Kombucha or Kefir, these are much more complicated families of microbes that haven't even been characterized completely. And likewise, I think what's in our digestive tract, you can get your microbiome sequenced and all of that, but I think we're shooting in the dark a little bit still when we try to figure out exactly what microbes are where in our bodies and what they're doing. And I think it's interesting and worthwhile to pursue this, but I also think that it's the fermented foods that humans have evolved with. I think what am I trying to say? I think sometimes we overthink this stuff, and if our goal is really to be healthier and happier, I think there's a certain amount of research is useful, and then after that, like, we can just sort of trust in the things that we don't know that they'll take care of us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense too. So
I mean,
in the fermentation community, what do people tend to just like ferment one thing and they're happy with that, or do they ferment like a whole bunch of things and get into it and try to ferment as much as they can? Like, what do you see in this world, in this community?
What's great about it is that everyone does it their own way. And even just making sauerkraut, some people do it one way, some people do it another. Some people like to do it in little jars. Some people like to do it in giant crocks. Some people like to do it in 5-gallon plastic buckets. But that some things, I have some friends who are very methodical and like they're doing deep dives into making kombucha and figuring out exactly what kind of fruit they like the best in it and what herbs work well. There are people with bees, and if you have bees and you have a lot of honey, then chances are you'll make some kind of honey-based ferment like mead, or there's a honey-based kombucha relative called June. If you don't have bees, then it's sort of impractical to make those because the honey gets really expensive. So I think a lot of it is contextual, but a lot of it, like there's certain things I like to eat and certain things I don't. I like kombucha because I can ignore it for 2 months and come back to it and my kombucha will still be alive. Whereas there are some other fermented beverages that you can't really look away from them for 3 or 4 days without they're dying. So I think a lot of it has to do with people's temperaments and what people like to eat and the rhythm of their lives. And yeah, I don't know. I don't think I can generalize.
Well, do you think people have fermented products more for health or for taste or for some other reason?
I try not to hit people over the head with the health stick too much because, if people think they're doing something because it's good for them, they might not enjoy it the way they could if they are doing it because they think it's fun. But I think, interestingly, the answer to a lot of these questions is sort of all of the above. And maybe that's part of what appeals to me about fermentation, because I'm definitely a both and person and not an either or person in many parts of my life. And so like some people do it for fun, cooking can be meditative. I think it's a way of connecting with your community. Cooking can be meditative and relaxing for some people, not for others. Some people have to do it for health. There's some people who don't have to do it for health, but they do it because they like the taste. They want to make something that's delicious. Yeah. So I guess, all of the above. Okay.
And then what are the first things that people will tend to ferment? Like, what do they feel most safe with, or, what are the easier things to do first?
I like to recommend sauerkraut because, first of all, cabbage is really cheap and you can get it pretty much everywhere in the world. Maybe there's some places in the tropics where it's too consistently hot or humid for cabbages to grow, but even then, so the sauerkraut, it doesn't require, my whole thing is getting people in the kitchen to ferment something. And then like once they've, a lot of people, especially in the US, have kitchen anxiety. Like they spend more time watching cooking shows than they spend cooking. And then once they get in the kitchen, they're sort of not necessarily comfortable. And so sauerkraut is a great starting point. And it's also a good, it's a canvas that you can be creative on. You can make your plain sauerkraut and then maybe you like it with some beets in it or some, caraway seeds or maybe you want to throw some other vegetables in there. And few ingredients, no special equipment. Something like sourdough bread is fine, but it's a more involved process. And like cucumber pickles are actually pretty easy to mess up. Like you can make, your pickles can get soggy and mushy, and then, that's not much fun. And, sort of white stuff can grow on the top of your jar of pickles, and then you're freaked out because, you're worried about food safety. Sauerkraut is pretty durable and pretty, I won't say foolproof because it can you can't mess it up. But it's good. It's simple. It's pretty reliable, and it's interesting. And I tell people, you make some sauerkraut and then you bring it to your friend's house for a dinner party, and it's something new. It's everyone can bring a 6-pack of beer or a bottle of wine, but not everyone's going to bring sauerkraut. And so it's sort of it's interesting. It's fun. It's a little edgy. It can be sour. It can be a little funky, but it's still within the again, most people are up to at least try it, and then if you try it, and then you can make it your own. You can make it younger and crunchier. You can make it older and more soggy and more sour. You can put it on a sandwich. You can use it as a side dish. You can put in your soup. All these things you can do with it.
And how do you know when the ferment is working or it's not working? Is it easy to tell, or is it not so easy, and are the consequences bad if you taste it and it's gone off?
With most of the vegetable ferments, it becomes pretty obvious if something goes wrong, because if something goes wrong, then within a pretty short period of time, like a couple of days, there will be gnarly, fuzzy stuff growing on it, and your common sense will prevent you from eating it. I mean, generally, if you're doing a ferment within certain parameters, if you're doing a vegetable ferment or dairy ferment, if you smell it and it's horrifying, or if you look at it and it's terrifying, then something went wrong, and you don't need to go any further. But otherwise, it's fine. And also, sauerkraut, if you don't like it, or if you mess it up, then there goes $2 of cabbage, and it's not the end of the world. Then the protein ferments like meat, and the Asian protein ferments with like tempeh and miso, they're a little trickier, partly because they're more involved. It may be harder to know when something went wrong. I'm not saying that people shouldn't do them, but they're probably not the right place to start if you haven't fermented something before, because there's a feeling when you're fermenting, you have to sort of take a leap, because all our lives we're told to put things away in the refrigerator. And in order to ferment, you have to consciously leave something out of the refrigerator. And I'd like to see people do that with something that's going to succeed first, and that they can build their confidence, and then they'll do the harder ones once they feel like they're in control of this uncontrollable process with invisible forces at work.
So okay, so it's pretty. I mean, ferments are pretty safe. Like, what if you make one and it does have a little bit of mold, but it's really small. You don't see it, and you taste it anyway. Is it pretty obvious, like, wow, something's wrong here, or is it hard to tell sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. With a lot of the vegetable ferments, again, like if something bad's going to happen, like you'll see it. I think people have different answers to this. Some people say, oh, if there's mold on the top, you can just pull it off and throw it away, and what's underneath is fine. I think for some people that might be fine, and for some people it might not be. In terms of eating it, there are people who are extremely sensitive to certain compounds, and they're probably better off not eating that slightly moldy, sauerkraut where the mold was on the top, and there may have been some little bit. I mean, a lot of this stuff isn't really black and white. Like what makes one person sick might not make another person sick. But having said that, fermented food, like if you can leave sauerkraut out on the counter for 2 weeks and it's not moldy, then it's definitely safe. Even 5 days, in a lot of these cases, the mold spores will grow on the top of the mold spores. Really need air, like they can't survive under liquid. And so if you make sure that your vegetables or your product, whatever it is under the liquid, then, there's not really going to be mold growing on it. And even if it's just a question of sort of dunking it under the liquid once a day, the procedures that, I describe in the first book, Real Food Fermentation, for making sauerkraut, and also most of the procedures on the internet are pretty safe in terms of they're not only safe, but they have a high probability of succeeding. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say what will work for everyone, but the chances of you're making yourself really sick making sauerkraut are probably lower than, say, eating a lot of potato chips, I think, in the long run, at least.
Okay. So what was your goal in writing your books? What did you want to bring forth and help people with?
That's another question that I can only answer in retrospect. At the time when I wrote the first book, I was approached by the publisher and they said, "Hey, we understand that you know a lot about fermentation. Would you like to write a book?" And so I had a choice between writing a book and not writing a book, and I decided I would rather write a book. In retrospect, I think, when I grew up, I saw, terrible things happening in the world around me, and I didn't like the way politics were going, and I felt like I was supremely out of control, and I had I could go to marches and protests and, shout and wave my hands, and it wouldn't matter. And there was nothing I could do to tip the balance of the world and microcosm or macrocosm towards more power to the individual and the individual human. And I feel like being taken over by industry. I figured out again in retrospect that one of my consolidation of power and production and all this, like the Industrial Revolution had its points, but it's also had its problems. And in particular with the food system, applying the lessons of the Industrial Revolution to our food system has been disastrous in a lot of ways. Like you can mass produce cars and that's great. But when you mass produce food, you start running into problems like soil depletion, like you lose a lot of the nutrients in your food and a lot of processed foods and produced foods that are unhealthy for us compared to what you could make at home or what you could make if you're growing your own. So to make this, to answer your question, this is an outlet for my radical politics in some ways, that we're taking power out of the hands of industrial food producers and the health insurance and pharmaceutical companies, and we're reclaiming it, some of it for ourselves as individuals. We can make our own food. It'll be healthier. We won't be at the mercy of industrial food production and everything that comes with it. And we will, if we can feel that and embody it, then we will feel more in control of our lives. And by the way, we'll also be healthier and stronger and happier just physically. So I think that's why I did it, but I didn't know it at the time.
Yeah, I gotcha. So what, I don't know, what feedback did you get to your books and to, all your, everything that you do? Any interesting anecdotes of people or, common fears or questions or uncommon ones?
In terms of the mechanics of fermenting, or in terms of like, I mean, I can go with that question. Do you have something in mind when you're asking?
Yeah, I'll be a little bit more specific. So, I mean, well, we'll start with fears. Like, maybe we've covered them, but what kind of fears do people have about, fermenting?
I think people, especially nowadays, like we've become so specialized that we want to trust experts to do things. Like we trust experts to make our food for us and to tell us what to eat, to heal us, to, tell us what to buy. And, since maybe after World War II in the US, homemade food has been a lot less. We have more people in the workplace. We're eating more frozen food, processed food, and we've lost confidence in, our food. So I think a lot of people are just, they have kitchen anxiety. They haven't spent much time in the kitchen, and they're just nervous about like, well, what if I can't do it? Or, what if I mess up? What if it's not perfect? And the great thing about fermenting is it's fairly fault tolerant and robust. And if you look at, 5 different procedures for making sauerkraut, they're all going to be pretty different, and they're probably all going to work too. So I think people get very focused on not doing it wrong. And so I think, my answer for that is you're probably not going to do it wrong. And the process of trying is, we don't necessarily, it's not like it's taking a risk, but it's trying something, it's developing a new skill, it's trying something that you haven't tried before. It's a learning process. And I think that's healthy, especially as we become adults and as we become more encultured to let experts do things for us. Like, this is something, we can do for ourselves, and we can be our own amateurs, really, and not have to have the experts do everything for us. And some of that goes with health too. I mean, I don't want to tell people to go out and diagnose their own problems, but possibly we can avoid some of them by eating foods that will either make us healthier or that'll displace unhealthy foods we might be eating instead.
Gotcha. Okay. So what are some interesting anecdotes that you heard from people?
Interesting anecdotes, in the second book that Raquel and I wrote, there's a recipe in there for tepache, which is a pineapple wine. And this recipe uses all the parts of the pineapple that you can't eat, like the husk, not the crown part, not the leafy part, but the husk and the core. Chop it up and add a bunch of sugar and then put some water in it, and literally just put it in a jar with a cloth over the top, and you wait several days, depending on how warm your kitchen is, and it'll turn into this sort of bubbly, sour pineapple wine. And it'll be different every time. And if your timing is off, it'll turn into pineapple vinegar, which is also lovely. And I've talked to a lot of people who said, oh yeah, we also make that in such and such country, and we call it this, and we don't make it that way, but we make it this other way. So a lot of these ferments, I think putting a recipe like this in a book is a starting point rather than an ending point. I think I would be disappointed if people read our books, and never and did exactly what we said and never elaborated on it, or never thought of we make it this other way. And so I didn't exactly answer your question. I could take another swing, or you can ask another.
Well, here's an example. Do many more people ferment than one might expect? Are there certain countries that are famous fermenters? They're just known for it. And in writing these books and talking to so many people, what are interesting, curious things that you've learned about the whole process?
Yeah, there are a lot of people who ferment without knowing it, I think. Like the first time I fermented, I did. No, I mean, in a good way. Well, in a bad way too sometimes. But, the first thing I fermented, well, no, I won't even say that. I'll say the first thing one of the things I fermented once was kimchi. I read this recipe for kimchi, and involves you do all this stuff, and then you leave the jar out on the counter for a few days, and it gets bubbly. And I was like, oh, it's in a recipe. I can do that. And it got bubbly. And I don't think I really understood what was going on, but I made it, and it was good. And then, a couple of years later, I read about fermentation. I'm like, oh, that's what was happening in that kimchi. Those were microbes, eating the cabbage and making it bubbly. But if in Ethiopian and Eritrean food, there's this bread called injera. It's like a spongy bread made out of this grain called teff, and that's fermented. Like you add some water, and then you leave it out on the counter, and it starts getting bubbly. And after a few days, there's similar things like in India. There's like dosa. Idli, I think, also fermented. There are these batters with lentil flour, chickpea flour that you a similar thing. You leave them out overnight or a couple of days, and they get bubbly and frothy, and then you turn them into these pancakes or dumplings. And there are all these fermented things that people say, oh yeah, of course we make them this way, but without necessarily knowing specifically as fermented foods. But before people had refrigerators, everything was going to ferment. If you have milk and you don't have a refrigerator, at some point it's going to ferment. And the interesting thing there is if you have pasteurized milk and you leave it out, it becomes terrible. But if you have unpasteurized milk and you leave it out, it turns into this almost like yogurt drink that is actually perfectly good and safe to drink. The old European American name for it is clabber, and is just something that people drank because, you milk the cows, and then at the end of the day, some of that milk's sour and you can still drink it. And then 2 days later, it's even more sour. So I think traditionally before the refrigerator, a lot of people had more fermented things, or like fruit salad will start to turn into fruit wine ever so slightly if you leave it out. And the more alcohol develops in it, the less likely it is to get, moldy or something like that. Anyway.
Are there any weird things that you tried to ferment or other people have that you were like really surprised? Like, oh, I didn't know you could ferment that.
Recently people have been doing more protein ferments, and this is the realm of the mold ferments, really. I know you have my friend Kirsten Shockey on your show, and
mm-hmm.
she's an expert on the mold ferments. You can ferment just about anything with mold, because mold will break down anything like meat, vegetables, grains. Some of the things people make, like in the old days, a very popular thing to do is make fish sauce, and you basically put a bunch of fish in a barrel and let them rot, and then pour off the liquid, and that's your fish sauce. People were doing that in ancient Rome. People still do that in East Asia. You can achieve a similar result. You can make anything sauce with the enzymes produced by the right kind of mold. And so, people do with table scraps or with lettuce or whatever. I won't say it's weird, but it's. I guess I'm happy to engage with it, but I think my focus is really on what I can get people to do, how I can launch people with fermenting in the kitchen. And so I guess I focus less on the weird stuff and more on how I can get people to be less afraid of it, rather than making it into a sort of spectacle or weirdness contest. Although I'm very down for the weirdness contest in general, but I don't want to make fermentation into a more of a freak show than some people may already think it is.
Right. In terms of processed foods, it seems like they're not amenable to being fermented. Is that like a generality that's true or not?
Well, there are a lot of processed foods that sort of mimic traditional fermented foods. Like there's a class of sour drinks. Sort of, maybe we can choose kombucha as a representative, since a lot of people know what kombucha is these days, and they're sour and a little sweet and maybe fizzy. And soda was definitely developed as an industrial facsimile of these sour drinks. And rather than waiting around for it to ferment, you say, okay, we can make it bubbly by injecting some carbon dioxide, and we can make it sour by adding some phosphoric acid. And let's make it really sweet so that people drink a lot of it and put all this sugar in it. I think in a lot of cases, processed foods are sort of fake fermented foods. And I'm not the first person to say that. I mean, certainly Sandor Katz has been saying that for a while.
I was wondering if in general, processed packaged foods are not amenable to fermenting. If you need more fresh produce and things like that, it wouldn't even be a good idea to try to ferment processed foods, or you're headed for trouble.
Yeah, I mean, you can ferment all sorts of things. I've experimented with prolonging the life of salsa by adding some sauerkraut or some kind of fermented starter to it and stirring it, leaving it out on the counter for a while. You can do a lot of stuff. I think those are a lot of processed foods. Again, like the processed foods themselves often, if they were ever fermented, like most of them weren't, and if they ever were fermented, they've usually been killed just for shelf stability, because a fermented food that's still alive is going to be maybe generating carbon dioxide gas, or maybe it'll be growing and changing, especially if you don't keep it in the refrigerator. But so the best, the sort of philosophically purist way of fermenting things is you grow them and then you ferment them, like you stay with them for the whole life cycle. And that's not realistic, because a lot of people in the world can't grow their own food because they don't have any land to do it with, for whatever reason. So I won't say that it's not good to ferment packaged foods, but if you can ferment fresh foods, it's a good thing to do. I don't want to tell anyone not to ferment certain things if they would work. And fermentation can be viewed as a way to breathe life back into things. Like, I view pasteurized milk as a highly processed food, and you can ferment that into yogurt, which is a fermented food, and that's a great thing. Like, I don't drink a lot of plain old pasteurized milk, but I have definitely my share of yogurt and buttermilk and cheese and other fermented milk products that come from processed foods. So I guess cheese, fermented dairy is an example where that's definitely, if you're willing to buy the idea that pasteurized milk is a processed food, which if we look at what happens to it during the processing, it's a pretty good case. Then fermented dairy is a case where that's the norm, even, I'd say.
Well, have you seen anyone that runs a commercial enterprise, a coffee shop, a restaurant, or whatever, and are they even allowed to do their own fermenting and serve it to customers, or has regulation caused it to only be allowable in the home and for oneself?
That's a really good question, and it's sort of a gray area. Part of it is the permitting authorities want to understand what you're doing in a restaurant, and this may be changing in certain parts of the country, in the world at least. I guess I'll only speak about the U.S. because that's what I know about. There's sometimes people will ferment things in their restaurants and just not talk to the inspectors about it. And people, really fermented foods are safer than raw foods, say. So there's not, as long as you know what you're doing, it's fine. But it's definitely a gray area, and also about what you can sell at farmers markets and what kind of permitting you even need and all of this. So it's I think that's an open question about what you're allowed to do according to the letter of the law, what actually happens in practice, what's safe to do, and it's complicated.
Okay. And then I always wonder, I heard this from a friend one time. We were in a grocery store, and he's like, these yogurts, they're like a touch fermented. They're fermented for 2 seconds just so they can say they are. And then they're sold to people. And if you do it at home, you can get, instead of a billion bacteria, you can get 1 trillion bacteria. And it's much better to do it at home. And, what are your thoughts on that?
I do think that home fermented foods are likely to have more diversity, more different kinds of microbes. They may have more microbes in absolute count. Although, some of the yogurt you can buy in a store is probably not very good. And some of it is probably fine. If it's kept in the refrigerator slows down fermentation of most things, really. So, yogurt will keep in the refrigerator for a good long time. And, it's losing some of its microbes along the way. But I don't know. I think also the perfect can be the enemy of the good in this case. If somebody says, oh, well, don't bother with commercial yogurt, or don't bother with, the commercial fermented sauerkraut when, you should only buy it at home. I think that's taking it too far, and it's not necessarily helpful, but, what are the actual counts? I don't know. The thing I will say is that there's some companies that have started either selectively breeding or modifying microbes, and then using those microbes in their yogurt, and then doing special research to prove that this microbe does X, Y, and Z, and then saying, oh, you can only get this microbe in our yogurt. And I think that's just profiteering, and it's very cynical to take. This happens a lot with traditional medicines too, aspirin comes from the bark of I think it's a birch tree or something, and it's a traditional medicine in South America, I think, and we extract what we think is the active ingredient, and then we concentrate it, and then we patent it and try and make money selling it, and it's sort of offensive to me. I understand, the necessity of it in some ways, but it's still, I don't know. The whole thing that the whole industrial revolution thing has its problems, but we're sort of stuck with it. I'm realistic about it, but I think it's important to see its weaknesses too, even as we're part of it.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. So, I don't know, is there any way to tell, the food you make, how much bacteria it has in it? Does it feel different or taste different to have something where it's like, whoa, is it really fermented or not? Can you tell?
Well, in fermented drinks, like when I make my own kombucha, you make the kombucha and then I'll usually do a secondary bottle ferment. So I'll put the kombucha in a bottle with a little fruit or some, extra sugar in some form, usually fruit. And I'll close the cap tight and I'll leave it on the counter at room temperature, and it will get fizzy. And the fizziness is evidence that there are things alive in it that are eating sugar and making carbon dioxide, basically. So that's evidence of life. I suppose you can gauge its aliveness by how fizzy it is. It's pretty imprecise. You could try to figure out how much carbon dioxide it's generating divided by how much time, and infer from that like the rate of metabolism of the microbes and all that. For some people, I think that's the interesting part of it. For me, I guess I'm not. I think we get in a lot of trouble in the West. We can be very reductionist, and I think in some cases it's important to break down these processes and understand exactly what's going on. And there are a lot of people who are inclined to do that, and that's great. Again, that's not as much my thing. I think like if we can get people to do this, I think like, one batch of sauerkraut you make will be very alive, and then the other one maybe for whatever reason won't be as alive. And like, one batch of yogurt you have will be very alive and another one won't be as alive. But as long as it's safe, as long as you enjoy it, it's almost certainly better for you than like any number of other things you can eat. And like, I don't know, I guess microbe counting and classification isn't what gets me excited about it. But I think there are people doing that work, and it's important to our understanding of it. But definitely. And some people will say, "Oh, I ate that and I felt great immediately." I'm maybe not as sensitive, just good and bad, because I don't get sick either. I'm not as sensitive one way or the other. Yeah, I don't know. That's my thing.
So, all right. So, what are some good resources? Like, where can people get your books? That'll probably be a good start, and then any other resources for them.
I'll definitely say I'll plug my books, Real Food Fermentation, and the book I co-authored with Raquel, Kombucha, Kefir, and Beyond. I think for people interested in hot sauces, Kirsten's book is great. Fermented Hot Sauces, I think it's called. For people interested in mold ferments, her book on miso tempeh, etc., is great. For people who want sort of the big picture, a little anthropology, a little history, a little how-to, Sandor Katz, The Art of Fermentation, is still, I think, he says early in the book, he says, I didn't set out to make reference to all of fermentation, and he may not have set out to do that, and he did many other great things with that book, but I think it is a better overview than anything else I can think of. There are a bunch of other books that cover specific parts of fermenting very well. Like there's a great book on sourdough by Sarah Owens. But I think, the internet is full of information about fermenting. And I think once somebody has made a few things, they'll be pretty able to assess, the information that they encounter out there and see what sounds like fun to them and what doesn't. There's so many different things you can ferment. Nobody's going to ferment all of them. So people find the things they're drawn to, and the internet. Right. And if there's a particular culture, your parents or your grandparents, like if your grandparents are alive, ask them, what kind of food they made. Most of us are only 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 generations away from people who made all their own food at home. And I think anything you can do to get their stories from them while they're still around and video them or interview them. And
that's what your next book's going to be about, right? You're going around the world and interviewing all these old fermenters before they go, and you're assembling it into a book.
I don't know, but I've heard worse ideas, Rich. That's.
I think that's your next mission, maybe. I charge you with it here.
Okay.
Give you one.
Maybe I'll do it. Thanks.
I think that'd be cool.
Thanks for the encouragement.
Yeah. Well, very good. Well, it's been a great call, Alex. I appreciate you being here, and thanks for all your knowledge.
Well, thanks for being interested, and thanks for your great questions, and thanks for your great podcast, man.
You're listening to the Future Tech Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies such as artificial intelligence, stem cells, 3D printing, gene editing, Bitcoin, blockchain, the microbiome, quantum computing, virtual reality, and exploring space are much closer than you might think. In fact, many early versions of these technologies are in play right now, and the companies that are using these technologies are the focus of this podcast. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a thorny medical problem. Remember, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and tell your friends about it. Thank you.